612 Michael Cohen, 1320 WILS. So the case of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl continues. He's now in an outpatient care center at a Texas military base. And the military says their investigators have not yet interviewed him while he's going through therapy. But to really get a sense of what might really be happening, we're joined by Brian Bouffard. He's a former JAG officer and himself a former Navy lieutenant commander. Now he still defends military members in court-martial cases worldwide. The website, jagdefender.com, jagdefender.com. Brian, thank you for joining us on WILS.
Mike, thanks for having me.
So when the Army says that, look, he's going through therapy and investigators will not interview him until those that have helped him recover say it's all right to do so, do you think that's really happening?
I do. That's standard procedure in a case like this. He is still going through the reintegration process, and all this news today means is that he's proceeding in that process. Hopefully it's going the way that it should. So he's been an inpatient in Germany and then in San Antonio, and then apparently he is now continuing his reintegration on an outpatient basis.
You've dealt with so many of these court-martial cases. So what is the Army doing? Because it is investigating. How quickly does it move on a case like this, even though they can't get a hold of Bo?
Right. They are doing what the Army calls a 15-6 investigation. And essentially that is a fact-finding investigation. It's not a criminal investigation. It's not conducted by law enforcement, although the results of 15-6 investigations certainly can be turned over to law enforcement depending on what they find. Now, Sergeant Bergdahl is going to have a right not to give any kind of incriminating information against himself, but at some point he's going to be offered the chance to be interviewed by General Dahl, who is running that investigation. And he'll either do that or not, but he's not going to be cleared to even talk to the general until the reintegration team says that it's okay.
The general that's running the investigation, are you familiar with him at all? Or?
You know, I'm not, but I know him by reputation, and he has a reputation as a man of integrity and a very good officer. So it's certainly my hope that the investigation he does is going to be fair and even-handed and very thorough.
So really, is it just the single general then that decides if a case proceeds against Sergeant Bergdahl?
You know, that's kind of an interesting question. In the normal course of business, yes, it would be up to a convening authority, a general with the authority to convene general courts-martial to determine what happens with him. Under these kind of unusual circumstances, though, with all of that we've seen coming out of the White House on this, bottom line is, if for political reasons the White House does not want him to be prosecuted, then that word is going to filter down to the convening authorities, and I doubt that a prosecution would commence if that's what they do.
Do you think the president can actually alter the decision to proceed on a case?
Well, the president is the commander-in-chief, and you know, he can't act in a way, or is not supposed to be able to act in a way that would be detrimental to an accused. In other words, if a subordinate commander made a decision in an accused's favor, it would be unlawful for higher authority to come in and say, no, let's do something harsher. But this would be kind of the opposite of that spectrum, and that would be the possibility that the White House would put the word out, hey, we, you know, for our own reasons, we do not want a trial. We don't want, you know, a show trial created out of this situation. And if they do that, then there won't be a prosecution.
Last time we talked, you said that the jury, the military jury, is one of the strongest parts of the system, that the soldiers involved, they really listen closely to instructions. But in a case like this where there's been so much news and probably any military person knows a lot about this, how does that affect the ability of a jury to be impartial?
I think by analogy, it kind of affects, you know, civilian juries in the same way when you have a very high-profile case that's gotten a lot of media attention. Frankly, I think and believe that the officers and senior enlisted folks in the Army who would be tasked with being jurors in this case, I think that they can do a pretty good job of putting that out of their minds and deciding the case based on the evidence.
You think there is going to be a case against him?
You know, it's so early to tell, but my gut's kind of telling me no. My gut's kind of telling me that, you know, they're going to do an investigation. There may be some administrative consequences for Sergeant Bergdahl, but, you know, right now I don't see him being prosecuted.
I mean, what would it take, even if he acknowledges, hey, you know, I did go off the base, I didn't intend to get captured, I just wandered away. Would that be enough to pursue a case, you think, or would it take more than that?
Well, if that's what he said, if he said, hey, you know, it was accidental, but he was clearly kind of doing something that he shouldn't have been doing. You know, in other words, leaving the base without authorization. That can be an offense. That's an offense known as Article 86, unauthorized absence. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they can prosecute him for that, and it tends to be a fairly minor prosecution.
Like, well, what's the penalty? What is the penalty for something like that?
Well, normally those cases are, you know, they can be handled administratively. They can be handled in what's called a special court-martial, which is kind of a misdemeanor level court-martial. Mm-hmm. For a routine unauthorized absence. But this case, you know, even based on what we know right now, is far from routine.
Okay, now what about the aspect that we had 6 soldiers killed while they were searching for him? Can that somehow be blamed on him, even if his leaving wasn't necessarily, you know, purposeful in terms of joining the enemy, something like that?
Well, I think so, and I think the way that would play out is not so much in the guilt or innocence phase, but if he were prosecuted for, let's say, UA, you know, AWOL, unauthorized absence, or desertion, or maybe even one of the more serious offenses like aiding the enemy or misbehavior before the enemy, the fact that 6 soldiers died looking for him is not relevant to whether he did or did not commit that offense, but it would be extremely relevant if he were convicted to determine an appropriate sentence. So I think that's how that would play out. Okay.
At the very worst, what do you think if a case is pursued, what kind of time do you think he would potentially face in a military prison?
You know, there's just no telling. It depends so much on exactly what they charge him with. Mm-hmm. It depends so much on the quality of that sentencing evidence that comes out. But the weird thing about this situation is if he did have the intent to remain away permanently and the government feels like they can prove that, then they can charge him with desertion in time of war. And that carries a punishment range mm-hmm. from no punishment at all up to potentially the death penalty. So there's a huge range of possible punishments that he could face, and there's really no way to even speculate about that right now.
Considering what he went through, do you think he's able to actually have a clear remembrance of exactly what happened on that day after, 5 years or so of being a prisoner of war?
That's a great question. I do think that the folks there with him on the ground in 2009, I think that they're going to have probably much more reliable testimony on that point than maybe Sergeant Bergdahl would himself.
Mm-hmm. And they've been less than complimentary towards him, right?
They have, yeah. Mm-hmm. It seemed, at least based on what I've seen and read, it's, you know, their attitude seems to be overwhelmingly on one side and not the other.
But his desire was what, to go to join the enemy? Isn't that what they're saying essentially?
Right. That's part of what I've heard. You know, I've heard that he may or may not have sent certain emails that I don't think would look good for him at all if that came out in a court-martial.
Well, what's the timeline on this? At what point would he face a charge? Within a year or less than that?
I honestly, Mike, I think that probably if a trial happens, we're still going to be talking about this case a year and a half from now, because it's going to take quite a while to get there, and the procedure isn't even going to start until his reintegration process is done. So that's going to happen completely in its own time. There's absolutely no time frame for that. So he better pack a lunch, because he's going to be in this thing for the long haul.
Brian Bouffard, a former Navy lieutenant commander, JAG officer, now still defends military members, court-martials across the world. His website is jagdefender.com. That is jagdefender.com. Brian, thank you so much.
Mike, thank you for having me. Take care.